Stories of leaders who turn faith into control and hope into destruction are as old as humanity itself. But what drives people to follow such dangerous figures? How can a charismatic speech transform crowds into prisoners of a distorted reality? From the forests of Shakahola to the jungles of Jonestown, these tragedies reveal chillingly similar patterns. Psychological manipulation, isolation, and fear of the apocalypse become weapons in the hands of pseudo-prophets who promise paradise but deliver hell. Why do we follow those who, instead of answers, offer an abyss? This is the fine line between faith and manipulation that we will explore tonight. After all, what makes us so vulnerable? Welcome to another night where mysteries never sleep. I'm Midnight, and this is 7 Nights. Human history is filled with charismatic leaders who, through convincing words, led multitudes down dark paths. Behind angelic smiles and benevolent speeches, many of these figures hid malevolent intentions, wielding faith as a weapon. What is it about these leaders that seems to hypnotize? Perhaps it's the promise of answers to profound existential questions, the kind that torment the human soul. Many find in these cults the illusion of stability, something modern life rarely provides. The mystery lies in how these leaders disarm even the most skeptical minds, seducing them with a blend of spirituality and manipulation. These cults often thrive in times of crisis, moments when humanity collectively searches for explanations amid chaos. Funny how chaos always brings its saviors, doesn't it? And in our fragility, we end up handing over the keys to our minds. It's in this fragility that pseudo-prophets plant their seeds. They don't just offer words, but a refuge, a structure where everything makes sense, even if that sense conceals an abyss. Under the promise of spiritual connection, they weave an invisible web made of carefully nurtured dogmas and fears. Those who enter rarely find a way out, like flies caught in a tangle of lies. The power of these cults doesn't lie only in what they preach, but in what they forbid. They erect barriers between followers and the outside world, isolating them from information, relationships, and even their own reasoning. Communication is controlled, and anything contradicting the leader's teachings is demonized. Gradually, the victims lose their ability to think independently, becoming pawns in a game they don't understand. The initial allure of mystery turns into claustrophobia, as if trapped in a house full of shadows and locked doors. And then comes the inevitable question: why do people follow such obviously abusive leaders? The answer is far from simple. Many leaders masterfully manipulate, creating a facade of kindness and altruism. Their words are like spells, appealing to their followers' deepest desires: hope, redemption, purpose. Little by little, the leader becomes a god in the eyes of the faithful, someone whose words cannot be questioned. What remains hidden is not just the cult's ultimate goal, but what happens within each follower's mind. For outsiders, these stories seem absurd, almost unreal. How could anyone believe such madness? Yet for those inside, it all makes sense. Group pressure, rituals, and isolation create an alternate reality where the impossible becomes possible. It's as if a veil is placed over their eyes, revealing a world only the leader can explain. It's frightening to realize how vulnerable humans are to manipulation when searching for something greater than themselves. In the end, the greatest weapon of these cults isn't force, but control over the narrative. They transform doubts into certainties, fears into obedience, and sometimes faith into despair. For those who escape, the experience feels like waking from a nightmare, but the scars remain. And for those who cannot escape, spiritual imprisonment can be even more devastating than a physical cell. After all, whoever controls your mind controls everything. The International Church of Good News didn't begin with noise, but with whispers, small rumors about a man named Paul Mackenzie, who claimed to hear the voice of God. A former taxi driver, Mackenzie appeared unremarkable at first glance. But he knew how to shape words, turning them into promises of salvation. His tone was calm, almost hypnotic, as he spoke of the end times and the need to prepare for the encounter with Jesus. Slowly, those who listened to his sermons began to believe he was more than an ordinary man. He declared himself a divine messenger, someone capable of deciphering secrets from the beyond. Mackenzie employed a subtle strategy to attract followers. He portrayed the modern world as a threat to spiritual purity. Education, technology, healthcare, everything was seen as a trap of the devil, pulling people away from God. For the desperate, his words made sense. After all, the world was full of suffering, and Mackenzie seemed to offer an escape. But that escape was a dark road where control was absolute. He discouraged any independent thought, claiming that only he knew the path to salvation. And so, people began to isolate themselves, cutting ties with friends, family, and even reality. The peak of his manipulation came with the introduction of extreme fasting. Not ordinary fasting, but something deadly. He claimed the only way to meet God was to abandon the physical body, renouncing food and water. For those who believed blindly, this made sense. Hunger was seen as a sacred sacrifice, a portal to eternity. However, to the outside world, Mackenzie's actions were unthinkable. When authorities finally began investigating, the truth that emerged was darker than anyone could have imagined. Around the forest of Shakahola in Kenya, shallow graves began to surface. Each day, investigators uncovered more bodies, most of them children. It was as if the earth itself was trying to expose the horrors hidden there. Autopsies revealed deaths from severe malnutrition, but there was something even more grotesque: signs of mutilation. Rumors of organ trafficking began to circulate, but Mackenzie denied everything, hiding behind his sermons. He claimed it was Satan's work, trying to discredit him. To his remaining followers, he was still a saint. Here, horror touches reality. When the truth emerges from the forest, it doesn't come quietly, it screams. The investigation uncovered over 400 deaths, though the exact number may never be known. Many families vanished entirely, as if swallowed by the forest. The most terrifying revelation was how Mackenzie managed to sustain this cycle of death for so long. He wielded faith as a weapon, turning hope into despair and despair into submission. The world was shocked, but for the victims, it was too late. The lingering question is, how many other Mackenzies are still hidden, waiting for the right moment to act? At the heart of this story lies a disturbing truth. The people who followed Mackenzie were no different from us. They sought comfort, purpose, and connection. The mystery and secrecy woven into his words were irresistible to those already feeling lost. However, the price of this search was destruction, not only physical but spiritual. Mackenzie promised heaven but delivered hell. At the core of many cults is a central practice: alienation. To control their followers, leaders like Mackenzie sever ties with the outside world, creating a parallel reality. This isolation starts with small changes, such as abandoning certain technologies or limiting contact with friends and family. The idea is that the outside world is corrupt, while the cult's community is pure and protected. Gradually, followers come to see everything outside the group as a threat. It's a slow, almost imperceptible process, but deeply effective. The use of extreme practices, such as fasting, reinforces this control. When the body begins to fail, the mind becomes more vulnerable. Prolonged hunger causes hallucinations, which are often interpreted as divine signs. The leader uses these moments to reaffirm their authority, claiming that the visions are proof of their connection to the supernatural. Thus, physical suffering becomes a ritual, something that strengthens faith rather than weakens it. It's a perverse inversion of reality, where pain is seen as a path to enlightenment. Another critical aspect is information control. In the most radical cults, followers have access only to what the leader permits. Books, TV programs, the internet, all are filtered or banned. As a result, the group's worldview becomes completely distorted. People believe only what the leader says because they have no other source of knowledge. This intellectual isolation is one of a cult's most powerful weapons, as it prevents followers from questioning their experiences. Alienation is further reinforced by rituals and symbols. These create a sense of belonging that is difficult to abandon. For those inside, these elements are imbued with meaning and purpose. However, to outsiders, they often seem bizarre or even frightening. This contrast creates an additional barrier, making it even harder to leave the group. Followers feel misunderstood by the outside world, which pushes them further into the cult. These extreme practices not only alienate followers from the world, but also from themselves. Look at it this way: you don't just lose the world out there, you lose yourself in the process. It's like being erased bit by bit. Individual identity is erased, replaced by the group's identity. People become reflections of the leader, mimicking their words, gestures, and even thoughts. This depersonalization ensures absolute loyalty. After all, it's much easier to control someone who no longer has a clear sense of who they are. In the end, alienation becomes a prison. To outsiders, it's incomprehensible how anyone could accept such conditions. But for those inside, it feels like living in a dream where everything makes sense. Mystery and secrecy are used as keys to lock these minds, turning ordinary people into fanatical followers. It's a grim reminder of how the search for answers can lead to dark places. The tragedy that emerged from the shadows of the Shakahola forest is a chilling example of how far a cult's control can go. When authorities began exhuming the bodies, the scene resembled a nightmare. The shallow graves were hastily dug, as if even death needed to be hidden. Most victims were children, their frail bodies showing signs of slow and painful starvation. What was once framed as a sacred sacrifice for eternity was revealed to be a cold, calculated massacre orchestrated by Paul Mackenzie and his most loyal followers. The mystery surrounding the forest was not just the number of bodies, but also what was unseen. Some victims showed marks of mutilation, raising suspicions of organ trafficking. This possibility added an even darker layer to the story. Just how far was Mackenzie willing to go to gain power and wealth? Investigations couldn't answer all the questions, but the mere possibility chills the soul. The land around the forest seemed to cry out, its trees silent witnesses to unspeakable horror. Mackenzie's victims were not just statistics, they were entire families, torn from their communities and led to a place where promises of salvation turned into condemnation. The promise of eternal paradise, something deeply rooted in human psychology, was cruelly distorted. To these people, Mackenzie was not just a religious leader, but a literal shepherd, guiding his flock straight to slaughter. It's hard to imagine the terror and disorientation that overtook the followers as they realized they were being led to their deaths. The international media painted Mackenzie as a monster, but what makes this story even more unsettling is how he operated for so long. Kenyan authorities had received reports of his extreme methods, but never acted decisively. By the time they did, it was too late for hundreds of people. This institutional failure casts a dark shadow over the tragedy, a reminder of how silence can be as deadly as violence itself. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is that even as bodies were uncovered, there were still people defending Mackenzie, believing he was truly a messenger of God. The Shakahola case is an open wound in the heart of Kenya. It reveals not only human vulnerability to manipulation, but also the limits of blind faith. The forest, once just a landscape, now stands as a symbol of the darkest side of religion. Every tree, every shadow seems to hold secrets that may never fully be uncovered. Mackenzie promised heaven but delivered an earthly hell, so visceral that even time may not erase its mark. The tragedy in Kenya is not just a horror story but a warning. It reminds us that no matter how seductive the idea of easy answers may be, the cost can be far too high. What happened in Shakahola is not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern where faith and despair meet at a point of no return. And as long as there are leaders willing to exploit this vulnerability, the cycle will persist. In the heart of Uganda, in a small farming community, another story began, one that would end in ashes. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God was founded by Credonia Mwerend and Joseph Kibwetir, two figures with shadowy pasts but words that promised redemption. Credonia claimed to have received visions of the Virgin Mary, while Joseph presented himself as a prophet chosen to restore true faith. To their followers, they were nearly divine, figures capable of unraveling the mysteries of the end times. This promise of salvation became the foundation of a cult that quickly grew in numbers and fervor. The central message was simple yet terrifying. The world was about to end, and only the pure would be saved, those who strictly adhered to the 10 Commandments. The group adopted a rigorous lifestyle, marked by intense fasting, endless prayers, and near total silence. Followers believed that avoiding idle words brought them closer to God, but in reality, it made them easier to control. The community isolated itself, living as a modern Noah's Ark awaiting the apocalyptic flood that Credonia and Joseph predicted for the year 2000. But the year 2000 came and went, and the world remained intact. The movement, already under internal strain, began to fracture. The most devoted followers demanded answers, but received only excuses. Credonia and Joseph repeatedly postponed the apocalypse, claiming that doubts were the work of Satan. For the most fanatic, this was enough. For others, doubt began to grow, eating away at the leaders' control over the group. It was then that the founders made a desperate decision. They called their followers to a grand service, promising that the moment of redemption had finally arrived. What unfolded that night was pure carnage. Credonia and Joseph locked the followers inside a church and set it on fire. The flames consumed everything, turning the sanctuary into a literal hell. Those who didn't perish in the fire were poisoned or killed in other parts of the compound. More than 1,000 people lost their lives in that massacre. The subsequent investigation revealed the extent of manipulation and cruelty involved. Credonia and Joseph had used faith as a shield to hide their true intentions. They knew the apocalypse wouldn't come, but preferred to destroy what they had created rather than be exposed as frauds. For them, the destruction was a final act of control, a way to ensure no one survived to tell the story. The leaders' ultimate fate remains uncertain, but their actions left an indelible scar on Uganda and the world. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God is a stark example of how fear can be weaponized. Credonia's visions and Joseph's sermons turned ordinary people into instruments of their own destruction. The mystery and secrecy in their messages created a cycle of devotion and despair that ended in tragedy. As with other cases, the lesson is clear. Faith, when manipulated, can become the deadliest weapon of all. Few things are as powerful as the fear of the unknown. Since ancient times, the end of the world has been used as a tool of control by those seeking absolute power. Cult leaders understand this vulnerability like no one else, turning the idea of the apocalypse into a prophecy that only they can interpret. This manipulation strikes at the core of their followers, who find themselves surrounded by an inevitable, grim future where only obedience to the leader can save them. It's a dark narrative, but an incredibly effective one, especially for those already searching for answers to their anxieties. In the case of Credonia and Joseph, the apocalypse was described in vivid detail. The Virgin Mary had allegedly revealed to them that the end was near and that only the purest would escape. Each sermon reinforced the idea that salvation was directly tied to blind obedience to the leaders. This created an environment where followers were constantly pressured to abandon doubt and embrace fear as the driving force of their faith. The community's mandatory silence symbolized this fear, a ritual of complete submission. This pattern of manipulation is recurring in cults worldwide. Jim Jones of the People's Temple employed a similar approach, blending elements of racism, socialism, and paranoia. He spoke of visions foretelling nuclear explosions and an inevitable confrontation between the United States and the rest of the world. To his followers, Jones was not just a leader, but the last hope for a doomed planet. It's chilling to consider how these narratives can erase any trace of rationality, transforming fear into an invisible weapon that keeps everyone in line. The fear of the apocalypse is particularly effective because it taps into a basic human need, to belong to something greater. When people believe the end is near, they seek connection with others who share their beliefs. This creates a sense of community that, while seemingly comforting, is actually a prison. The need to belong and the will to survive form a dangerous combination, which leaders exploit to solidify their control. Those inside the group feel safe, while outsiders are viewed as enemies. However, the fear of the apocalypse doesn't just destroy minds, it also destroys bodies. When leaders like Paul Mackenzie or Credonia sense that their followers are beginning to doubt, they resort to extreme measures to maintain control. Mass destruction is presented as redemption, a way to avoid the shame of being exposed. Instead of admitting their mistakes, they choose to erase all evidence, taking their blind followers with them. It's a tragedy that repeats itself with disturbing frequency, leaving a trail of death and suffering in its wake. At its core, what makes this manipulation so effective is its simplicity. The fear of the end of the world touches something primal in all of us, something that cannot be easily ignored. For cult leaders, it's the perfect pretext to justify their actions, no matter how cruel they may be. For followers, it's a reason to keep believing, even when everything around them screams otherwise. In the end, the apocalypse may never come, but the damage caused by believing in it is as real as any catastrophe the prophets of doom could imagine. The night that sealed the fate of the followers of the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God was shrouded in mystery and horror. Credonia Mwerend and Joseph Kibwetir gathered their followers with a promise. The apocalypse was finally at hand. The church where the gathering took place was decorated as if for a celebration. Flowers and candles illuminated the space, creating a false sense of peace. For the followers, this was the culmination of their lives, the moment they had sacrificed everything for. But in reality, it was a deadly trap. The leaders locked the doors as soon as everyone was inside. The sermons, usually long and exhausting, were brief this time. Credonia and Joseph asked their followers to pray silently while they prepared the final ritual. Within minutes, the smell of gasoline began to fill the air. What followed was one of the most brutal acts of mass manipulation ever recorded. The flames consumed the church quickly, turning what was meant to be a sacred temple into hell on earth. Screams of despair echoed through the night, but no one outside knew what was truly happening. The massacre didn't end there. Many followers who weren't present in the church were killed elsewhere. Poisonings, stabbings, and other methods of execution were used to ensure the movement's secrets would never be revealed. When authorities finally began to investigate, the scale of the horror became clear. Bodies were scattered throughout the community, each one telling a story of fear, submission, and betrayal. Over 1,000 people lost their lives, but the mystery surrounding the leaders remained. Some believe Credonia and Joseph also perished, while others claim they disappeared, like shadows into the night. The massacre in Uganda left deep scars on the country and the world. It exposed not only the cruelty of cult leaders, but also the vulnerability of their victims. The people who followed Credonia and Joseph were no different from any of us. They sought answers, comfort, and above all, salvation. Instead, they found destruction on a scale rarely seen. What's most disturbing is that for the leaders, this wasn't just an act of desperation. It was a calculated move, a cold attempt to erase their lives once and for all. Today, the story of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God serves as a warning. It shows how faith can be turned into a deadly weapon when placed in the wrong hands. The mystery surrounding the events of that night still lingers, fueling theories and questions. But at its core, the truth is simple and tragic. Credonia and Joseph chose to destroy everything to protect their power. And as so often happens, the innocent paid the ultimate price. The massacre is a grim reminder that the desire to believe in something greater can lead us to terrible places. The victims in Uganda left behind a legacy of caution, a call to always question those who claim to have all the answers. After all, sometimes the real apocalypse isn't the end of the world, but what we do to each other along the way. In the 1970s, a peculiar figure emerged in India, spreading ideas of spiritual liberation and material detachment. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, known as Osho, blended Eastern philosophy with modern meditation practices. His words held a unique allure, attracting followers from around the world. But behind his serene image and teachings of freedom, something darker was taking shape. Osho was not just a spiritual guru. He was a shrewd strategist who saw his disciples' devotion as an opportunity for power and wealth. What began as a movement of self-discovery quickly transformed into a global cult. The movement's initial headquarters was in Pune, India, where spiritual retreats drew thousands of seekers in pursuit of enlightenment. However, it didn't take long for Osho to desire something bigger. In 1981, he acquired a vast plot of land in the state of Oregon, USA, where he founded Rajneeshpuram, a self-sustaining and supposedly utopian community. The city boasted infrastructure worthy of a metropolis: restaurants, transportation systems, private security forces, and even airstrips. But behind this facade of prosperity lay total control over the followers, who worked tirelessly to keep the community running. Osho preached material detachment, yet he amassed a staggering fortune. His collection of Rolls-Royce cars was legendary, and his extravagant spending sharply contrasted with the simple life he imposed on the residents of Rajneeshpuram. This paradox didn't drive followers away. On the contrary, it seemed to enhance his mystique. They believed everything was part of a greater plan, one only Osho could comprehend. But as the city grew, tensions with local residents escalated. Osho sought political control of neighboring towns, even attempting to rename the town of Antelope, sparking fierce resistance from the population. The conflict culminated in one of the largest bioterrorism attacks in U.S. history. In 1984, Osho's followers, acting under orders from his assistant Ma Anand Sheela, contaminated food at local restaurants with salmonella. Over 750 people fell ill, and the incident revealed just how far the group was willing to go to achieve its goals. This was not merely a grab for power, but a stark demonstration of how Osho's doctrine of love and freedom had been corrupted by an insatiable hunger for control. The attack placed Rajneeshpuram under intense scrutiny, prompting authorities to finally take action. With the investigations, other accusations came to light, including conspiracy to commit murder and tax evasion. Osho was deported from the United States, and the Rajneeshpuram community was dismantled. He returned to India, where he continued preaching until his death in 1990. Despite this, his sect did not disappear entirely. Today, the Rajneesh movement survives in a new form, focusing on meditation practices and distancing itself from past controversies. Even so, the shadows of Rajneeshpuram remain. a reminder of what happens when power and spirituality intersect dangerously. Rajneeshpuram is a symbol of how even the purest ideas can be distorted. Osho offered a path to freedom, but ended up trapping his followers in a cycle of obedience and exploitation. The bioterrorist attack and the community's internal corruption revealed that, behind the sweet words, there were dark intentions. It is an example of how mystery and the occult can be used to mask abuse, turning spiritual pursuit into a nightmare of control and manipulation. The 1984 bioterrorist attack was a turning point for the Rajneesh community. Until then, Osho's movement had been seen as eccentric but relatively harmless. However, the mass poisoning revealed a far more sinister side to the group. Anand Sheela, Osho's chief assistant, orchestrated the attack to influence local elections. The sect wanted to ensure its candidates gained political control of the region, and to achieve this, they decided to incapacitate the voting population. The choice of method was as cold as it was strategic, contaminating food in restaurants and markets with salmonella. The plan was executed with chilling precision. Members of the sect infiltrated establishments and tainted salads, sauces, and other foods. Within days, hundreds of people began to fall ill, suffering from severe symptoms of food poisoning. Initially, authorities had no idea the incident was a deliberate attack. It was only after detailed investigations that the connection to Rajneeshpuram was uncovered. The attack shocked the nation, revealing that the sect was not merely a group of spiritualists, but an organization capable of extreme actions. Osho claimed he was not directly involved in the attack, but investigations suggested he was aware of Sheela's activities. Additionally, the attack uncovered other dark secrets within the community. Documents found in Rajneeshpuram indicated plans to expand the attacks, including assassinations of politicians and journalists. The idea that a spiritual movement could carry out such calculated acts of terror profoundly shook public perception of Osho and his followers. The mystery surrounding the sect became something closer to a nightmare. The repercussions were immediate. Authorities increased surveillance on Rajneeshpuram, and the media exposed the group's excesses and abuses. The bioterrorist attack not only put an end to Osho's plans in the United States, but also permanently tarnished his reputation. The guru, once celebrated as a spiritual visionary, was now seen as a dangerous manipulator. The image of Rajneeshpuram as a utopia crumbled, revealing a system based on exploitation, fear, and absolute control. Even after the dismantling of Rajneeshpuram, the bioterrorist attack continued to haunt the collective memory. It was a painful lesson in how blind devotion can be turned into a weapon. Anand Sheela was convicted and served prison time, but to this day, she defends her actions as necessary to protect the movement. This justification is as disturbing as the attack itself, as it shows how ideology can distort morality. The case of the attack in Oregon is a chilling reminder of how fanaticism can cross all boundaries. It reveals the depths of psychological manipulation and the dangers of blindly trusting leaders who claim to have all the answers. Osho and his followers turned an ideal of freedom into an act of terror, proving that sometimes the greatest enemy of spirituality is the human ego itself. When Reverend Jim Jones founded the People's Temple in the 1950s, he seemed like a man on a noble mission. His rhetoric combined social justice, racial equality, and Christian spirituality. To many, Jones was a charismatic, almost messianic leader who promised a future of harmony and inclusion. Yet there was something unsettling about his presence, a glimmer of absolute control that slipped through even in his most inspiring moments. Over the years, that glimmer became a blazing flame of paranoia and fanaticism, consuming not only his soul, but also those of thousands of followers. The People's Temple began as a conventional congregation, but quickly evolved into something larger and more isolated. Jones didn't just want to preach, he wanted to create a separate world where his visions could unfold without interference. Behind the facade of a loving community, the People's Temple became a space of rigid control, where every aspect of followers' lives was monitored. Fear was Jones's primary tool. He used veiled threats and displays of power to ensure the absolute obedience of his flock. By the 1970s, Jones's paranoia reached unbearable levels. He began speaking of global conspiracies, claiming that the U.S. government was plotting to destroy his community. These assertions led to the establishment of Jonestown, an agricultural colony in the jungles of Guyana. To his followers, Jonestown was a promised paradise, a chance to escape oppression and build a new life. In reality, it was a prison. Residents lived under constant surveillance, endured grueling workdays, and faced severe punishments for any insubordination. Jones's control over his followers was total. He held mass indoctrination sessions where he reinforced the idea that the outside world was a mortal enemy. At any sign of doubt or disobedience, he reacted with fury and retribution. Food was scarce, living conditions were harsh, and Jones himself descended into a cycle of drug abuse and growing paranoia. For him, Jonestown wasn't just a community. It was a stage where he exercised absolute power, testing the limits of his followers' devotion. The culmination of the tragedy came on November 18, 1978, when U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown to investigate allegations of abuse. He was assassinated on Jones's orders. Knowing that the net was closing in, Jones convinced his community to commit revolutionary suicide. He manipulated his followers into drinking a lethal cyanide-laced cocktail, promising it would free them from earthly suffering. Nearly 1,000 people died that day, including over 300 children. Jones, the man who had promised salvation, was the last to die, with a gunshot to the head. Jonestown serves as a grim reminder of the power of manipulation. Jim Jones began as a champion of equality, but ended as a spiritual dictator, leading his followers to their deaths. The story of the People's Temple is not just about one man or one cult, but about the dangers of fanaticism and blind devotion. It is a warning that even the noblest promises can hide dark intentions, turning dreams into nightmares. The Jonestown Massacre is one of the most disturbing stories of mass manipulation in modern history. What began as a utopian community ended in one of the largest recorded mass suicides. The dense and isolated jungles of Guyana became the perfect backdrop for horror. Under Jim Jones's paranoid leadership, the People's Temple turned into a macabre experiment in total control. But how did an apparently benevolent idea degenerate so drastically? Jonestown's isolation was a key factor in the disaster. Jonestown was a promised paradise, but how often is paradise just the gateway to hell? The colony's remote location meant that followers were completely at Jones's mercy. There was no escape, not even for their thoughts. The leader conducted white nights, regular rehearsals of mass suicide in which residents were forced to drink liquids they believed were poisoned. This created an atmosphere of constant terror, where no one knew if they would live to see the next day. It was a calculated psychological manipulation designed to break the followers' will. The arrival of Congressman Leo Ryan brought a glimmer of hope to some. During his visit, several people attempted to flee, begging for help. But the tragedy quickly unfolded. Ryan and members of his delegation were gunned down as they tried to leave the site. For Jones, this marked the end. He knew the authorities would come for him and decided he would rather destroy everything than face justice. The plan for revolutionary suicide was set into motion, and Jonestown residents were forced to drink the cyanide-laced cocktail. The scenes authorities encountered upon arrival were pure horror. Bodies were scattered everywhere, many of them embraced in their final moments. Children were the first to be poisoned, followed by adults, many of whom were coerced into participating. An audio recording made by Jones during the event reveals a man completely consumed by his madness, urging his followers to not be afraid. It is a chilling testament to the depth of his manipulation. Although Jones died that day, the impact of Jonestown resonates to this day. The event has become a symbol of the dangers of fanaticism and blind obedience. It also raised difficult questions about how isolated communities can become deadly traps. Jonestown was not just a tragedy. It was a dark warning about the limits of human devotion and the horrors that arise when one person has absolute power over others. The jungles of Guyana will never be the same. The soil where so many died carries a dark energy, a reminder of what happens when control replaces freedom. Jonestown is a scar on human history, but also a lesson we cannot forget. After all, the real terror is not the supernatural, but what we are capable of doing to each other in the name of ideologies and beliefs. The tragedies involving cults led by figures like Jim Jones, Paul Mackenzie, and Credo Niamwarand leave profound lessons about human vulnerability and the dangers of manipulation. In each of these stories, we see the same pattern: charismatic leaders who turn faith into a weapon, exploiting the fears and hopes of their followers. They offer answers to universal questions: the meaning of life, the fear of death, the promise of salvation. But these answers come at a terrible cost, often paid in lives. History reminds us that the desire to belong to something greater can lead us down dark paths. Isolation is one of the most effective tools used by these leaders. Whether in Jonestown, the forests of Shakahola, or Uganda's communities, followers were cut off from the outside world, severing ties with family and friends. This isolation allows the leader to control the narrative, creating an alternate reality where their words are law. This process of separation doesn't happen all at once, but in subtle steps, making it difficult for victims to realize what's happening. By the time they do, they're already ensnared in a web of psychological control. Another critical lesson is the role of fear in maintaining these cults. The imminent apocalypse is a constant threat, used to reinforce obedience and justify extreme practices. The idea that the world is about to end turns doubt into sin and questioning into betrayal. For many followers, the choice is not just between staying or leaving, but between salvation and damnation. This fear, combined with group pressure, creates an environment where the impossible seems inevitable and the absurd becomes acceptable. The manipulation by leaders like Jim Jones and Paul Mackenzie also exposes the danger of absolute power. These individuals not only controlled the lives of their followers, but also their perception of reality. They positioned themselves as intermediaries between the earthly and the divine, demanding total obedience. This kind of power, when left unchecked, turns leaders into spiritual dictators capable of justifying any act, no matter how horrific. In the end, what they offer is not salvation but destruction, both physical and spiritual. While these stories are marked by tragedy, they also serve as a clear warning. We must be vigilant against fanaticism and those who promise easy answers to complex questions. The line between faith and manipulation is thin, and history is full of examples of how it can be crossed. To question, to doubt, and to seek information are acts of resistance against the kind of control these cults exert. It is not just a matter of individual protection, but of ensuring that such horrors are not repeated. In the end, the tragedies of these cults are a reflection of the extremes we can reach when we abandon our autonomy. Autonomy. A simple word, but one that seems to slip through our fingers the moment fear takes hold. They remind us of the power of critical thinking and the importance of preserving our humanity, even in the face of the unknown. It is a dark but necessary reminder that true evil does not lie in the supernatural, but in the manipulation of what makes us human, our faith, our hope, and our desire to find meaning in life. This story is just one piece of a puzzle in one day. Maybe you'll see the whole picture. If this made you think, subscribe and like the video. It helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share. After all, more voices mean more discoveries. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this mystery captivated you. But I bet you haven't seen everything yet. Click on the next videos now to continue your journey into the unknown. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe so you don't miss the next secrets I'm about to reveal. But be careful, once you step inside, there's no turning back.